Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome everyone to today's Science Café. My name is Megan Sullivan, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Yale School of the Environment, and I work in the Public Programs Department at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. And I'd like to welcome you today. This is our Science Café series, which is a series dedicated to informal conversations with scholars on natural history themes. We're bringing together scholars across disciplines to speak about their research and participate in discussion with a public audience. So thank you all for being here as well. Just a couple of technical notes about the webinar and functions that you can expect when you're using the webinar. If you have any comments or thoughts that you'd like to share during the discussion, please don't hesitate to use the chat box to do so. We also have a Q&A box that's open specifically to receive questions that you would like the speakers to answer or respond to. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to use the Q&A box to pose those questions. And you can pose those questions whenever you like throughout the webinar. The Q&A box will always be open. And since we do want this to be an open discussion between the audience and the other panelists that we have here today, we encourage you to submit your questions early and submit them often so that we can have a nice discussion between everyone. And finally, our program is being live captioned today. So if you have never used live captioning before, normally in the bottom toolbar on your Zoom window, you can find the option to turn on captions in the lower right-hand corner. And with that, I will get started introducing our topic today. So we wanted to have a discussion about new tools to fight climate change. And this is inspired in part by the new Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. And as many of you may know, climate change is a threat that's unparalleled in both its scale and complexity. That is shaping a lot of the challenges that we're facing in our world today. And carbon capture is just one tactic that we have for mitigating the effects of climate change. So in this Science Cafe, we've invited Dr. Nilay Hazari and Dr. Craig Brodersen, two experts from different fields, to discuss ways that dependable, cost-effective, and affordable strategies can remove and capture carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. Just to give a brief introduction on each of our two speakers, we have Dr. Nilay Hazari, who was born in Fiji and grew up in Australia. He received both his bachelor's and his master's in science from the University of Sydney and completed his doctorate as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. He worked as a postdoc at the California Institute of Technology before joining Yale University in 2009, where he's currently a professor of chemistry. The long-term goal of most projects in the Hazari Lab Group is to develop homogeneous transition metal catalysts for chemical transformers, which could result in the development of more efficient energy and affordable industrial processes. We also have Dr. Craig Brodersen joining us today, who received both his bachelor's and master's of science from Wake Forest University and his PhD in botany from the University of Vermont. He has worked as a lecturer at the University of Vermont, a postdoc at the University of California, Davis, and the University of California, Santa Cruz, and as an assistant professor at the University of Florida before joining the School of the Environment at Yale University in 2014, where he is currently a professor of plant physiological ecology. And Craig's research focuses on the structure and function of plants, with a particular interest in how plants efficiently utilize two of the most limiting resources on Earth, water and light. His research highlights the implications of environmental conditions that push plants beyond their physiological thresholds. So with that, I will pass it off to Nilay and Craig to start our conversation.
Yeah, I thank you very much, Megan, Craig. Thanks for coming. Thanks to everyone else. Firstly, as Megan pointed out, I am from Australia. So if I sound funny, there's nothing wrong with your audio. It's my accent. As Megan said, my group works on converting carbon dioxide into valuable products. And I want you to do an exercise to kind of motivate you for why we want to do this. So look around the room that you're in. And what you'll probably see is you'll see your computer. It's made from some plastics. You'll see a chair. You will see the walls, and the walls are probably made from concrete. The reality is almost everything in your room is likely made from some kind of chemical which contains carbon. Some of you are probably at work and you traveled to work in a car. The fuel that is fueling that car is made from carbon. Currently, all of these enormously large carbon-containing products are made from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are valuable, they're often difficult to extract, and they're not really renewable. Once we've used them, we can't get them back. So the question that my lab tries to answer is, could we generate carbon-containing products from a renewable waste stream? We have a very abundant renewable waste stream, which is cheap, and that is carbon dioxide. So we essentially want to capture carbon dioxide by chemically converting it into valuable products that we all use, like plastics, large-scale chemicals like methanol, which are used to make a whole series of other chemicals that you use, and fuels. Other people are interested in converting carbon dioxide into cement so that we can build buildings from a waste stream. So the particular focus of my group's research to solve this grand challenge is to develop better catalysts for converting carbon dioxide into these valuable products. So a catalyst is something that facilitates a chemical reaction. So to give you an example, I can take carbon monoxide, which is one chemical, and hydrogen, which is another chemical, and if I react them together, nothing will happen. And that will be true if I left them for 500 years. If I add a catalyst to that mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and if it's the right catalyst, it will produce fuel in a matter of minutes, because that catalyst facilitates the conversion of carbon monoxide and hydrogen into fuels. What my lab is trying to do is develop catalysts that will convert carbon dioxide into valuable products like plastics and fuels. And I will say that chemical conversion of products is one, of carbon dioxide into products is one strategy. Craig looks at an alternative strategy which involves biology, and that can also be a pathway to convert carbon dioxide into valuable products.
All right. Hey, yeah, that was great, Nilay. So sort of building on the type of work that you were explaining there, and the opportunities for doing some of these kind of synthetic approaches to pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. One of the things that we're sort of focused on, among the many things that we do in our lab, is trying to understand how plants are basically doing the same thing. So taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into plant material. We have a couple of different things that we focus on. Certainly one is just the basic process of photosynthesis, converting atmospheric CO2 into simple sugars that the plants then convert into more complex carbohydrates that turn into things like wood, right? So this is just an example here of a relatively dense form of carbon dioxide. So this is a cross section of a pine tree. And this material, once it's laid down in this form of cellulose and lignin, is fairly stable long term. And we're interested in that process and how all sorts of different plants over the millions of years of plant evolution, have come up with some really novel solutions for both doing the more standard form of photosynthesis that we see in many plants, but then some of the more recent innovations over the more recent several million years of concentrating carbon dioxide inside the leaf and inside the cells that are in the leaf to improve the efficiency of photosynthesis. So we're trying to understand this very fundamental process that, this is where all of our food comes from. And this is ultimately where all of those fossil fuels that Nilay was just talking about, where those came from millions of years before they were buried below the ground. We're really interested in focusing on the inside of the leaf and taking advantage of some of the imaging tools that we've developed with a bunch of our collaborators to basically study the inside of the leaf and understand how it works to soak up CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in particular, that you can think of the inside of the leaf as a sponge for basically absorbing CO2. And the question for us is basically, how have plants arrived at the structures that we see today in the inside of the leaf? How good of a sponge are they for CO2, and are there opportunities for improving can we make a better sponge? I suppose is for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and making plants more efficient. So.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. We did just have our first question in the chat. This comes from Flora, and she says, I'm really curious what kinds of byproducts are produced in the chemical reactions from the catalysts that could convert CO2 into carbon that can be used to make things like plastic and concrete.
Yeah, thanks, Flora. It really depends on what the other reactant is. So in particular, when you're trying to make plastic from CO2, one of the processes involves reacting carbon dioxide with a chemical molecule called an epoxide. And actually, in that case, all of the feedstocks are converted into your product, which is a polycarbonate polymer. And as a result, there really aren't any byproducts. So similarly with concrete, what you really want is you want the concrete to absorb the CO2. And when it does that, there isn't byproducts. Having said that, there are many transformations that you could imagine converting carbon dioxide into, which will result in byproducts. This will be more for converting carbon dioxide into things like fuels. And just like any other chemical process, you'll need to optimize the process to limit the amount of byproducts that are formed. And you also hope that those byproducts are not going to have deleterious consequences, either environmental or health-wise. And if they do, you really have to take steps to mitigate their formation. But the specific byproducts are going to depend on the exact process.
And so then maybe I can ask a follow-up question here for Nilay and also for Craig. Nilay, you're working with chemical processes. Craig, you're working with biological processes. And I was wondering, what about natural processes or already existing processes have inspired your work and your research? Is there something particularly that you saw or learned about that sort of was the catalyst for your carbon capture research that you do in your labs? Sorry, that was a catalyst pun. That was bad.
Craig, you want to take this one first?
Sure. I think, I started my career and the majority of my career has primarily been focused on just sort of studying, exploring the fundamental biology of plants. There's a surprising amount of just the basic physiology of plants that's still sort of unknown. And there are a range of opportunities for digging in and the recent focus has been toward trying to understand how plants are going to respond to these sort of novel environmental conditions that they're now faced with as a result of this rapid climate change, and trying to understand sort of the tipping points of the different species that currently exist in our forests, for example, and trying to figure out, based on the projections that the modeling community gives us about what type of how much the temperature is supposed to increase, or changes in precipitation patterns, how we might be able to predict which species are going to survive and which species are not from the fundamental physiological level. And even more recently, we sort of turned our attention to this issue of food security, trying to figure out how to possibly convince plants to accumulate more CO2 into these dense carbon-based molecules and store them below ground, simply because of the urgency of the issue of climate change right now. And so that's really caused us to sort of refocus a lot of our efforts from taking advantage of the advances that we made and just start understanding the fundamental biology of plants and applying it in this way. So instead of just sort of studying things, the natural diversity of plants and how all sorts of different plants do it, putting that the research focus on the applied side to help solve this problem.
Yeah, so I guess my connection to biology is a little less tangible, but it turns out that enzymes are essentially nature's catalysts. And enzymes can trigger some really amazing chemical reactions. So when you're trying to evaluate a chemical reaction, we've already heard about one of the things we really care about, which is what are the byproducts. So probably you want your chemical reaction to go from your starting material to your product with no byproduct. That's known as 100% yield. You also want selectivity, right? So byproducts will lead to poor selectivity. You want high selectivity, and you want it to happen fast. And it turns out that enzymes are really remarkable at doing a large number of chemical transformations, including converting carbon dioxide into some really quite valuable products. The problem is, for us as a society, enzymes work on really small scale, right? In your body, you're making a very small amount of chemical. Whereas if you think about large chemicals like plastics, we literally make millions of tons. And it's really hard to scale an enzyme to make a chemical on a really large scale. It's expensive. They're often quite sensitive. So what we try and do in our lab is we try and think grandly about how does an enzyme work? What types of interactions do enzymes have with the chemicals that enable them to do transformations selectively and enable to do them rapidly? And so a specific example for those of you who are more chemically literate is that enzymes use hydrogen bonds a lot to facilitate selective transformations. So where possible, we might try and use hydrogen bonding in our synthetic catalysts to try and facilitate the reaction more easily than it otherwise would be.
Great. And I think that was partially, or at least an entry into an answer to one of these questions that was in the chat, which asked, this was audience member David, who asked, which catalysts seem promising, which have been disappointing, and which ones would you like to try in the future?
Yeah, so there are some commercial catalysts for converting carbon dioxide into valuable products. So for example, in Germany, there is a mattress which is made of a polymer called cardion, which is made from CO2. What we would really like to do is, I think, make fuels from CO2. In Iceland, there is a commercial plant which takes carbon dioxide and hydrogen and makes methanol. Methanol is a fuel. So why don't we have this plant everywhere? We don't have this plant everywhere because Iceland has very cheap electricity, and you need that electricity to generate hydrogen, and the hydrogen is used to make the CO2. It's also true that the European Union has subsidies for producing green fuel. And so the methanol that's made from this process is not economically competitive with methanol, which is made using the conventional process, which comes from fossil fuels. So the subsidy makes it economical. So I would say that our catalysts for CO2 to methanol are promising, but they're not yet good enough for large scale use. Because the question I have for the audience is, how much are you willing to pay extra for a green material? So we know that in cosmetics, people will pay more for an environmentally friendly cosmetic, but we know that for things like fuel, you're not going to pay a cent more probably for that fuel. So we need to be economically competitive with whatever is out there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then there are a couple questions for Craig here as well. One person, this is from Arnold. He asks, can you explain how trees absorb carbon dioxide and how does it affect their lifespan? Thank you.
Sure, that's a good question. And I'll try to pick up some of these others that are sort of floating through the chat and the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah, all good questions. So, when you look, I, bring this back up, right? So this is, I'll zoom it in here. So this is just a, a cross section of a pine tree. It's maybe 8 inches across. And, what this represents is about, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, or 30 years. You can see those individual kind of concentric rings. Each one of those rings is represents a year of growth for this particular tree. This one is harvested from the northeast corner of the state. At the university has a forest there. The School of the Environment runs it, and we like to look at the cross sections of these trees to understand their relative growth rate over time. And so when you look at this, when I hold it, it's not particularly this particular species isn't super dense. But what this is made of is often kind of surprises people. So this is basically air. So most of the water, we think that, wood and the parts of the tree that we see that are parts of our furniture, we think that most of that, comes from the ground. But in reality, most of what this material is air. It's just CO2 that's been converted into a form that's stable and that provides a pathway for water to move up to the top of the tree so that it can help pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the basic idea is that a leaf, on the underside of the leaf, usually on the underside of the leaf, there's these millions of tiny microscopic valves that open and close. They look like a teeny tiny little mouth. They open, and when they open up, atmospheric CO2 will diffuse into the leaf. And in the same process, what happens is water will evaporate out of the leaf. So most of the water, approximately 95% of the water that a plant pulls out of the soil actually just goes straight out into the atmosphere, and the plant doesn't do anything with it other than that. The remaining 5% is used in that photosynthetic reaction to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere and convert it into a sugar. And then from there, the plant can move those sugars around the plant through a specialized tissue called the phloem. And then those sugars will be used in all the various different places in the plant to basically produce more plant material, whether it's roots or whether it's new leaves or branches or fruit. And the main enzyme that's responsible for that is called rubisco, and it's, Nilay and I are both talking about enzymes, and this particular enzyme is, one of the most, if not the most abundant enzyme on Earth, and that's the one that is basically functioning in all plants to do this process of photosynthesis. So it's basically the process of converting air, CO2 in the air, using the energy from the sun and water and a few other minerals in order to convert it into CO2. And then the plant has this amazing array of biochemistry at its disposal to convert, just to convert that very simple sugar molecule into all sorts of, basically everything that you see on a plant. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm seeing several questions here sort of on the theme of moving from the terrestrial space into a marine space. People are saying, why not use algae instead of higher plants? We hear a lot about the CO2 sequestration potential of land plants, but what about the sequestration potential of marine plants? And then also a question about algal biofuels. So are there possibly combined approaches of using catalysts to produce or speed production of algal biofuels? Not sure if what the level of expertise is with marine or algae in general or specific, but I would love to hear you guys talk a little bit about these marine questions that people are asking.
Ray, do you want to talk a little bit about marine organisms being used to capture CO2?
Sure. Yeah. So that's the earliest photosynthetic organism probably in the water, or were in the water, and then eventually moved on to land. And so most of the early in the Earth's history, the atmosphere had a lot more CO2 in it and quite a bit less oxygen in it. And the photosynthesis that took place in the oceans basically pulled down atmospheric CO2. And as a consequence, the atmospheric oxygen content increased, which was great for us. So that's the byproduct of, one of the byproducts of photosynthesis is oxygen, which turns out to be really great for us as humans, as we need that to breathe. And the oceans obviously represent a significant portion of the total surface. And so we absolutely should be paying attention to the oceans as possible, what we call sinks, or places where this atmospheric carbon could go. So there are a number of different research groups around the world that are interested, that are thinking about things like fertilizing the oceans in order to increase the production of algae in aquatic systems as a way to pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then those organisms eventually die and sink to the ocean floor. And the idea is that a lot of that carbon would be sequestered there for a long period of time. Definitely sort of outside of the areas of interest that we work on. But I think that one of the threads that comes out of a lot of these conversations about natural climate solutions or opportunities for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere to sort of offset our emissions is that we're going to need a lot of different strategies. And so I started out my career working with vascular land plants, and sort of that's where I felt my expertise was best applied. And so there are plenty of people out there working on algae systems, and I think we're probably going to need every single one of those options to be on the table as we sort of proceed. So there's a lot of potential there, in particular for algal biofuels, and it's a matter of getting the technology up. And I think it's Nilay brought up a really good point about whether they're economically competitive with current sources of energy that we have at the moment.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's been a lot of work into algal biofuels, especially in the early 2000s, and almost all of the companies unfortunately went bankrupt because it just was not competitive with our current fuel sources. Now that may change moving forward, but right now that technology is not competitive. One of the points I want to make in regard to using oceans to have more algae, or putting in some kind of mineral carbonate into the ocean, which is going to absorb CO2, is we don't know what the unintended consequences of doing this are. Our natural system is kind of very harmonious. And just like we have perturbed the system by increasing our combustion, which results in more CO2, what you may not realize is the actual amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is very, very small. It's literally 400 ppm. And so we've gone from maybe 270 parts per million to 400 parts per million. So an increase of 130 parts per million. And it's had a dramatic effect on our climate, and it will continue to do so. But similarly, all of a sudden putting more algae in the ocean, it's not exactly clear what will happen. And our timescale for taking action means that we're going to have to try a variety of different things and maybe see what the consequences are in real time.
Great, thank you. I was thinking there was one question here, Nilay, about how far are we from making plastics from the waste stream versus using fossil fuels from an economic point of view. But it sounds like what you guys have sort of been saying is that A, we're pretty far from finding that as an economically viable solution without subsidies, and B, it's going to take a lot of putting these different processes together so that they're all working at the same time in order to come up with climate solutions. Like there's not just one silver bullet, we're going to convert all of the carbon dioxide into plastics, or we're going to shove all of the, carbon dioxide into the ocean and create a bunch of algae or like grow seaweed that everyone can then, we're all going to become seaweed eaters or something like that. What I'm hearing is kind of it's the diversity of solutions that is really going to save us here.
Yeah, so maybe I can respond a little bit more specifically to the plastics question. So not all plastics are the same. So the plastic in your water bottle is very different to the plastic in your car. And we can make some plastics from carbon dioxide. Some of those plastics are commercially competitive and are in fact commercially available and are in fact cheaper than current plastics. Others of them are more expensive, and other types of plastics we simply cannot make, right? Like what we would really be able to make is a plastic from CO2, which will generate a polymer or a plastic like polyethylene, right? So polyethylene is one of the biggest plastics in the world. It's used in things like plastic bags. Can we do that sustainably from carbon dioxide? That is a different chemical challenge. So in fact, plastics represents a large number of different chemical challenges in its own right. And right now, the plastics that we use on the most significant scale, we do not have replacements that involve using carbon dioxide.
Thank you. And there is one follow-up question here in the Q&A from Eric. I think this is directed towards you, Nilay, but maybe Craig, this is also relevant to your work as well. Are significant energy inputs needed to make the chemical reactions occur?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends on the chemical reaction, right? So there are some reactions which occur very readily. So maybe an example of this is some of you may have used a ice pack where you literally crack it in your hands and then it goes cold. So when you do that, that is actually a chemical reaction. You're breaking the ice pack and two different chemicals mix, and that chemical reaction happens immediately. And as a result, the ice pack gets cold. And so clearly the energy input for that chemical reaction is not very high. In contrast, if you're trying to cook a souffle, you have to heat it to a very large temperature. And so the input for that chemical reaction is much higher. What makes carbon dioxide, turning it back to the specific question we're trying to answer here, a very challenging chemical to work with, is that the energy input in order to convert carbon dioxide into something valuable is typically high. You need to react carbon dioxide with something which normally takes a lot of energy to make in order to make these valuable products. And the ways we would like to do this are using something like electricity, which we hope we can generate from solar energy, so that becomes renewable. Use something like hydrogen, which again, we hope we can generate in a renewable fashion, or perhaps directly use sunlight, because there's a lot of energy being generated from the sun and hitting Earth every day.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, speaking of sunlight, there is a question here for you, Craig, that was asking, is it true that the Earth has become greener? And if so, to what scale?
Sure, it's an interesting question. So, we need to sort of put some boundaries or some guardrails on that question in terms of our time scale and what we're thinking of. So, if it's as short as just the past, and where on the planet you're also talking about. So, there are, certainly in the grand scheme of things, in the long evolutionary history of our planet, then yes, it certainly has gotten a lot greener on land once the plants came from the ocean and started exploring what we call the terrestrial realm. And there are examples like here where we're at in New England, where most of the over 75% of the forests were cut in the early 1700s, and then certainly for farmland, and then as the forests came back to a certain extent. Since the probably mid 1800s up until now. So our forests, or a lot of the agricultural land that was here in New England, went back to forested landscape, and that's now sort of interspersed with suburbs and other human development. But certainly it's kind of a difficult question to, in the last 20 to 30 years is the question there. So again, it's kind of depends on where you're talking about. So certainly we've done, we as humans have caused a lot of deforestation over this period. We are losing forests in a wide range of places due to massive forest fires. You look out west in California, and certainly there are those areas that are certainly where we're losing green space. It'll probably come back, but it's going to take a long time, and it's probably going to look a lot different. So certainly, if you look at things from the perspective of a tree, they're in many situations, they're sort of limited in terms of the CO2 that they have available. They've got to spend a lot of water pumping it up from their roots out to the leaves in order to pull that CO2 in. But there's additional CO2 in the atmosphere that we've been putting in. That's generally a good thing for plants, but they're also spending a lot more water to get it. So things are, there are places that are greening up, but there's certainly places that are not so green anymore. And those are the really worrying places.
Great, thank you. And I think here's an interesting question from Stephanie that I love this question. Are plants growing faster today than a few hundred years ago due to the higher carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's been a number of places across the globe where scientists have set up these experiments called the free air carbon exchange experiments. There's one that was started at Duke University, and there's a bunch of them now that have scattered around the world. And basically to ask that question, so if we increase atmospheric CO2 concentrations, what happens? And the general response is that trees do a little bit better. They grow a little bit faster. They put on a bit more growth in the short term, but in the long term, it's kind of negligible. And what ends up happening is that they usually become limited by something else. So it's usually that the nutrient in the soil become depleted faster, or that the water available to them is then the limiting factor. So there's an initial response where there's some in these experiments where they inject additional CO2 around a stand of trees and then follow the growth rate of those trees and the other plants in that community over time. But the general consensus from a lot of these studies is that there's an initial growth spurt, but then there's always something else that's limiting. And so one of the things that plants will do, because they're really concerned about how much water they're consuming and using, and that's passing through the wood and out to the atmosphere, is that they're very careful with regulating those little microvalves on the underside of the leaf. And so if they have enough CO2 inside of the leaf to do photosynthesis, then they'll close. And so it's probably a short-term type of effect. And what we're dealing with now is that they may have more CO2 available to them, but now the atmosphere is a lot warmer, and so that pushes them outside of their comfort zone in terms of water, in terms of the temperature, or they're water limited now because there's a drought in some areas. And so we've maybe made things a little bit better in terms of the amount of CO2 that's available for the plants, but there's now something else that's limiting their growth.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Rachel had a comment here: old growth trees versus sapling/young trees and their ecosystem benefits with regard to air quality is a large differential. And then a quick follow-up from Julia. Adrian, wouldn't too much growth too fast cause a stress to trees, creating separate problems such as being more susceptible to diseases?
Yeah, so those are good questions. We're learning more and more about the carbon sequestration, carbon storage capacity of different forest types. So there's a range of opinions on this. Certainly we know that as these really large trees, so these old growth trees, we might call them, a lot of people are familiar with the very charismatic giant sequoias and redwood trees out in coastal California. Those trees store massive amounts of carbon, and given the fact that they live or can live for thousands of years, that sort of represents a really long-term stable carbon storage reservoir. So once those trees start to come down, they will start to decompose, and all of that CO2 that the plant had taken out of the atmosphere and turned into wood will start to decompose. And so we're also beginning to recognize the importance of having those old trees in those forests, and having a stand of trees that's of mixed ages ends up likely holding more carbon than one that is brand new. Certainly, if you have a number of high density of young trees, at least in the short term, they will accumulate a lot of carbon because they're growing rapidly. They're growing in height over their first 10 or 20 years. But then, so there's different ways to manage forests for different means to an end. And so I think we need to think about how we're using our forests and what the benefits that we want to get out of them are, whether it's recreation or forest products, and how we balance all of those competing demands. Yeah, and then I guess to get to the question about the diseases and susceptibility there, there's certainly some limitations to. It's going to depend on a lot of times it's going to be species dependent. And then the really fast growth rates, the trees can handle a lot. And so certainly if you put them in a situation where they're not necessarily well supported or growing faster than they maybe would normally, then you might get some that are a little bit less stable perhaps, but they're generally able to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. So super interesting. We've spent a lot of time in the forest now, and I just wanted to throw another question back to Nilay. I mean, when we're thinking about scale here, when we're talking about these solutions, there's only so much land that we have. There's only so many forests in the world. And even if we planted trees on, every single square meter of land, it's questionable whether that would actually capture enough carbon to take care of the emissions that we've been generating over the past, couple hundreds of years. So in terms of these chemical processes that you work with and scale, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about like how they are complementary and maybe how some of the stuff that you're developing fits into the picture with some of the plant stuff and the forest stuff that Craig is talking about.
Yeah, so I think first I'll give a general answer to this. Carbon capture as a field is one aspect of the overall portfolio that we as a research community are recommending to society for mitigating problems relating to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Undoubtedly, the best thing we can do is go to technologies that do not have emissions of carbon dioxide, emissions of methane. So this would mean that we don't drive cars that operate on an internal combustion energy. So perhaps we have electric cars, but that would mean that we need an electric car which is powered by electricity, which comes from sunlight, which we don't have at the moment. So for us to go to carbon negative technologies right now is completely infeasible without dramatically affecting all of our quality of lives, right? People want their heat, need their heat, people want their air conditioning. So while we're developing these technologies, which we hope will transition to in say 30, 40, 50 years when the technology is there, we need to complement it with carbon capture. And carbon capture can be capturing in the oceans, capturing through forests, etc. The scale of most chemicals is small relative to the amount of carbon dioxide that we release into the atmosphere. But the point about making chemicals from carbon dioxide is we need those chemicals anyway. So it's serving some value to society because it's providing an alternative way to make these chemicals. And in the process, it's using some of this CO2, which is a waste. The reality, however, is that it's the large-scale carbon capture in nature which is going to make the biggest difference to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And even that is something we probably only want to do while we're transitioning to a society where we don't use technology which generates a large amount of carbon emissions. And I don't know, Craig, that might be a topic that you want to address as well.
Yeah, the scale I think is one of the is a huge challenge, right? So there are a lot of one of the big things that people have been getting behind recently is something that maybe we can we'll plant millions and millions of trees and plants have millions of years of sort of research and development on this front. So they've got it, in terms of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and turning it into carbon. We need to, at the same time, if we plant all those trees and we scale up and we do all those plantings, we need to also consider the costs that are involved in maintaining and managing those forests so that all the effort that goes into planting those trees doesn't go to waste because they are planted in places that might not be suitable for them, or we basically don't want all those little seedlings to die. And so there's an initial input there in terms of the scalability, and people have done the carbon accounting to try to figure out if we plant this certain number of trees on this certain limited number of acres, how much CO2 is that going to lead to in the long term. There's still a lot of uncertainty in in whether or not we're going to be able to maintain and manage those forests so that they end up down the line in 20 or 30 years to actually pull out the carbon that we think that they're going to. And so that's where I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunities for interacting and engaging with the public and landowners and globally in order to if we're going to make some of these decisions to do things on a massive scale, we need to think about the sociological implications. We need to think about the economics of it, and making sure that whatever initial investment that we make, we back up with the maintenance that's going to take down the line. So I think that the scalability thing is a huge issue, and we also need to try to be as confident as we can about to increase the certainty of our projections. And so if we do this change, what's the actual effect going to be, or what's our how confident are we in that in those numbers? And Nilay made an excellent point earlier about if we start fertilizing the oceans or increasing the amount of photosynthetic activity in the oceans from algae, there may be all sorts of unintended consequences that we either can predict now, but our level of certainty is not high enough to do it, or something may come up that causes an negative unintended consequence. So we need to be really careful, but I think we also need to consider all sorts of options.
Yeah, and like one of the things that I kind of think about, there's not only carbon capture in trees, there's carbon capture in a lot of different plants and a lot of different ecosystems. And I think people really have, a tree as sort of the avatar of this is a thing that captures carbon really well. But even, like in savanna ecosystems, there's a lot of carbon that's stored underground and roots and stuff like that. So there's also all of these implications about like if you're going to start planting trees somewhere where there aren't trees, how does that disrupt the carbon capture of that already existing kind of stable ecosystem that also has, a lot of other things that we value, like you said, sociologically or culturally, maybe like biodiversity. There are so many angles which we have to consider, once you start dipping your finger in and changing these things, there's a lot of different unintended impacts that we can have. And so I did want to ask, there's one question here about genetic modification. And I think I might be wrong, but I was maybe thinking that this was a bit about agriculture, because we talked before about what are the potentials of different, food systems. Someone was mentioning, I think, corn or maybe soy in one of the questions. And then there was also a mention of biofuels, I think, at some point. So when you're thinking about like corn or biofuels as an alternative fuel, like are those places where we could also capture more carbon in addition to, making the biofuels grow more efficiently to produce fuel, making the food systems more efficient to produce higher yields of food. And either Craig or Nilay, both feel free to chime in on this one.
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think one of the things that we do in our lab is try to sort of explore the amazing sort of range of biological diversity that we do have access to. So the plants that are out there right now are a great source of inspiration to us. Because those plants have been throughout their evolutionary history, an enormous range of environmental conditions. And so there's a lot that we can learn from both the natural diversity of plants, but then also the different varieties of maybe, for corn, for example, is a good one, right? So there's all sorts of varieties of corn, and then the different species that are closely related to a lot of the agricultural species that we're interested in. And so, there's a range of opportunities for gaining improvements in yield, and understanding a lot of these varieties from places that perhaps haven't been historically used in kind of conventional breeding programs is really important. Thinking about alternative crops as well that happen to do really well in dry environments, drought environments, and that a lot of implementing that and getting people to accept that is sort of a sociological thing that we need to, and a marketing thing that we need to work on, where we might be able to swap out some of these. Certainly, there are lots of opportunities, at least as far as research goes, to understand how plants work by manipulating the genetic code of the plants. So changing out one gene at a time to understand how that affects the growth of the plant and the development of the plant, and then getting to the things that Megan was just talking about, converting that into the food that we eat. So I think doing this fundamental research with those types of plants is extremely important. We're going to need to know how plants work, and have a lot of options on the table, because we're going to need those down the line, especially trying to feed this growing population on the planet, and especially in these areas that are much less wealthy than the country that we're in right now. And many of those are going to be facing severe droughts, and I think we want to be able to have some options for those people, so that they can feed themselves.
There's another question here in the chat that I saw, and I think, Nilay, this would be a good one to pitch to you, because we're almost towards the end of the hour here, but this is from Brianna. And she says, have you been able to harness carbon capture credits to help make materials more economically viable, or is it the scale problem again? And I think this was in regards to talking about like some of the carbon capture catalysts or mechanisms that were not economically feasible that we were talking about before.
Yeah, so for me and my group personally, the answer is no, because we haven't got something to that level of commercial viability. But certainly in other places, the carbon credits or carbon tax like subsidies are meaning that people use technology which involves converting carbon dioxide into a fuel or some other product that they otherwise would not have been able to. So there's no questions that economic subsidies can make technologies which are not feasible.
Yeah, great. I guess since we are getting towards the end of our time here, do any of you have any final comments that you would like to make, or anything that you'd like to say to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I personally am always in awe of what the scientific community can do. So I think about in the last 2 years, how quickly we've been able to develop a vaccine for COVID. And not only is it effective, we've also developed engineering strategies which have literally enabled us to make it so that you can inject it into millions of arms at a time. It's remarkable. And I think that moving forward, we can solve a lot of the challenges associated with climate change from a scientific perspective. It's going to take people working on a number of different angles in order to do that. What I sometimes worry about is just having the science isn't always good enough for implementing the change. And that requires research from social scientists. It requires scientists doing a better job talking about their research and why it's important. But overall, I personally am an optimist, and I think this is a solution that this is a problem that we're going to solve. And I don't think that we're going to leave a world which is completely uninhabitable for our grandkids.
Yeah, I agree. And these types of conversations are, essential both between people like Nilay and I and Megan that are in, we're scientists, as our profession. That's what we do every day. But, communicating between each other, even though Nilay and I are in very different fields, we can learn a lot from each other. There's opportunities for collaboration, and that's great that we also need to be directly engaging with the public, which is why I think this is such a a great venue that the Peabody has put on as an opportunity to get us out and talk to people and answer some more questions, because the more knowledge that the public has, the better choices they can make both in their daily lives and the way that they vote. And providing them a voice at the table in the decisions that are being made that affect everybody. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, a note of, optimism and positivity for the future. This may be a huge challenge, climate change, but it's something that can certainly unite us as we fight for solutions to, solve this problem. And as you said, just come together as a society to, do what we need to do civically, socially, in order to come together as well. It's not just all science. It's a uniting aspect in multiple areas of our lives. And I think that's something that is really important. And sometimes, for me, it doesn't always come through when we're talking about climate science and climate change. Oftentimes, it's really one line about the science. And so it's been really great to talk to you guys today and to bring up all of these themes, to bring you guys together. I had a lot of fun talking to you. I had a really great time receiving all the questions from the audience. So thank you, everyone, who submitted questions. Thanks, everyone who, even just if you didn't submit questions, if you are listening, I'm sure you'll come up with questions to submit next time. There are a lot of other talks that are going to be available. You can check those out either on the Peabody social media pages, or we also have a mailing list at the bottom of the Peabody website that you can sign up for if you're not already a part of that. And we'd love to make sure that all of you know about all of the upcoming programs that the Peabody has to put on for you. So thanks again, Nilay and Craig. It was really great having you here today. And finally, thanks to everyone in the audience. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Thank you so much.